Together, we're going to learn how to fix an actual rally car. We're going to use my favorite epoxy. This is Magic Resin. This is just some dollar store epoxy. The reason I use the dollar store sometimes is because it dries very quickly. So I use it for holding certain things in place. And it's sort of a brittle epoxy, so that if you end up getting it somewhere you don't want it, it'll just chip right off. It only actually bonds to material, whereas this stuff, you can make it bond to pretty much anything. So the multiple parts I'm going to be fixing with this job is actually the hood here. You can see the carbon fibers sustain some damage from going off. There's also a little bit underneath. There's some delamination between the underside layer and this. I'll be starting with the top. I've already taken down some of the major cracks, and the reason I've done that is so that whenever I put the new epoxy over, it won't just fill in the crack. I actually want to cover it over and bond that together. And as you can see, this is what I would call a brittle epoxy. So it's kind of chipping and cracking. And if you come over here, we have the extreme opposite. This is an incured epoxy that hasn't properly cured. And the customer brought me this piece that had some of this bad epoxy on it. And I just wanted to point these out because the reason Magic Resin I find is actually better is because it's one-to-one mixing. So you don't usually end up with this. Even if you're off with your mixing, you could never mix it that bad that it would be this fragile, or this brittle. What you would get, what I have is, as you can see, is a really strong piece. It's got some flex to it. We're up to another step here. One of the things you didn't see me do was I like to use agricultural grade isopropyl alcohol as my solvent for cleaning. I'm sure some expert somewhere may tell me that's wrong. I like it because it's the least offensive of most of the solvent cleaners, and it works really good with the Magic Resin, and especially if you want to wipe it off before it cures, rubbing alcohol will take that right off. So that's just your isopropyl alcohol. I found it's actually cheapest at agricultural stores. Our local version is M&R Feeds, but if you find another place that's probably called something Feeds, you'll likely find a good deal on a gallon of it. I find it's been the best one for me. And maybe you will too. I'm sure maybe somebody will suggest something better. But for me, it's what's been working the best and has the best price. Now, what you're also seeing here, this is sort of my mixing setup. In certain situations, like the deeper cracks, I like to inject the epoxy in before I clamp it together. I really like to make sure I get it right in there for a proper bond. And then this is actually my high-tech mixing setup. So what I do is I actually take the stick, we go all the way to the bottom of a pill container. These have a flat side. I mark the side of the container, and then I lift it up and I mark it again. So it's super easy. You can use any kind of stick. Obviously, you don't have to use a pill container, but it just happens to work for me. Due to the powers of movie magic, here is actually my mixed epoxy. Bubbles are fine. The way I do things, I actually will remove these in the process of using the epoxy. In many cases, you don't want that, but this is going to be a structural layer, and I am going to be removing all those. You won't see any of that. And what you're seeing, this big messy thing, this is actually a piece of plexi. I use this as my work surface. In case I spill anything, this has a nice edge around it that I can use to stop any epoxy from going all over the place, and I can carry it around. And then because it's plexi, a lot of this stuff just chips off. So whenever you get big chunks, it stays reusable. It doesn't end up uneven. Everything will still sit level. And you just kind of bend it and take off the chunks. You're actually, all the rough stuff you're seeing is the plastic wrapping from the back. I haven't taken that off yet, so I eventually will have another side to work from that will be perfect. And the other key tool I like to use, this is just a razor blade. You'll see it's been in the shop for a bit, so it's got a little bit of corrosion on it, but that's one of the key tricks I use. Once I syringe on the epoxy into the right places, the razor blade will help me spread it around. And then I find this epoxy works pretty good for self-leveling. And again, this is just sort of a repair layer to prevent further damage while I'm doing the rest of the work. There's a lot of work to go on the underside. Thanks again to the powers of movie magic, I can actually show you that the epoxy is hardened. I've gone ahead and taken the tape off. You can see where the epoxy has actually built up against the tape. I've got to sand that down, but I'm going to sand the whole thing anyway, obviously. I just wanted to make sure that while I worked on the underside and relaminated things, that I wasn't going to cause any further damage or shape distortion to the rest of this hood. And it appears that the epoxy is nice and bonded. It's worked pretty good, and we'll keep going. All right, so I've gone ahead and cleaned up all the edges around where I'm going to actually have to do some joining, and I've removed any loose pieces. I may end up replacing that piece rather than put it back. But as you can see, I've exposed all the fibers that were not previously exposed on any joint. That way I can get a good solid bond. And as I mentioned before, bonding is very important, as it's the difference between sticking and combining. And you want to combine your layers. You don't just want to stick layers together, you want to combine them. Otherwise, it'll just eventually chip off. And we don't want that. All right, thanks again to Movie Magic. Here we got the results. You can see how I have taped in some replacement parts. I've taped some seams together. I've taped in what I call epoxy gutters. That means I can just load in epoxy, it'll stop at the tape, and then I just peel off the tape and sand it down. It's super easy. I've done that in a bunch of places. As you can see, I've actually spliced in a new panel here. This is a homemade carbon Kevlar panel that I've made. I've exposed the fibers on it, exposed the fibers everywhere. I've now then epoxied it in, and what I'll do is sand it a little more to shape, and I will epoxy more with some additional cloth to make sure that that is one solid piece, because the previous piece broke off. And then as we come over here, you can see that I actually had to rebond the layers of the hood together. So I've done that, which you'll see in a moment whenever I take off the tape here. Again, that is like an epoxy gutter to make sure I don't lose any of that precious epoxy. We come over here, you'll see how I have, again, epoxy gutter set up. But one of the things I do to make sure that I don't ruin a bolt hole is I actually use just a little bit of tape. And so that, obviously it's epoxied in there, so it's not bonded, but it is quite stuck. And we'll do the same thing for that. But then you'll see that everything's rock hard, whereas this was actually a completely separate piece whenever I got this. And what I'll be doing next is sanding everything down, giving it another pass of epoxy. You can see I had to splice in a piece here, the carbon Kevlar. And one of my gutters didn't work, so I do have to remove some excess. But for the most part, you can see the epoxy stays where you want it to go, as long as you use the right kind of tapes and things as a gutter. Okay, so what we're actually going to learn now is how to do a tape gutter. So what you do is you take your fingers, you just kind of fold over so that we get a sturdy edge here. That's going to actually give it a lot of strength. So when we come on over and we put it right where we want it. Now, the benefit to having that tab on there is that we can actually pull it off even if it gets stuck, because it can't get fully stuck. And when the epoxy runs up against that, it won't go past it. Sometimes with tapes, the epoxy actually finds a way under the tape, but I find that by adding that little ridge there, it doesn't do that. It won't lift the tape as easy.
All right, so I've got the mask back on. Movie Magic has gotten me quite a few steps ahead here. The reason I like to harden up all my little bits and pieces before I do major sanding is because I actually use a wire wheel. I find the wire wheel does a great job of exposing fibers so that you can get a real good bond. So you'll see even the spots I've already glued, I've gone back over with the wire wheel. I've also brought down my epoxy ridges a little bit. Like, I still have lots to go. But the reason I like to start with something structurally sturdy is because I really like to get at it with the wire wheel. And if you have bits that are loose, this is going to throw them right off. So that's the reason I kind of start with an extra step of hardening the broken piece so that I can fix it later.
Okay, so just a little example of how my tape gutters kind of work. You can see this looks like tape, but it's actually not. That's the leftover epoxy. But the tape is peeled off nice and clean, and all I've got to do is either shave or cut that down and keep going. But it's not dripped down below, which allows me, as you can see, I've stacked the two projects so that while I'm working on one, I'm actually working on two. And if I happen to see a spot that might needs a extra epoxy, I can do that at the same time without having to move projects around. Now that everything is cured and secured down, what I'm actually going to do is really get rough with this thing. I'm going to go at it with sanding. I'm going to remove all the chips that I possibly can. The reason I went ahead with the epoxy is I've had unbelievable luck with the Magic Resin not reacting with anything, and as you can see, it hasn't reacted. It has bonded just beautifully everywhere. So I knew that that would allow me to keep the shape of the hood while I was rejoining the pieces underneath. So what I didn't want was the top of the hood to distort while I did all that work underneath. So it looks like that line has held beautifully. Everything is held nicely. So next step is sanding, and we'll see what that looks like shortly. Right under the lip of this hood is actually a rubber seal. So I don't want epoxy to get in that. I want that to stay nice and soft so that it still does its job. So I put the epoxy gutter around there. And you'll see once I take that down that it was like it was never there. But it's important that you don't use masking tape. You want to use a plastic tape. Don't use duct tape because the glue is a nightmare. You want to use packing tape. It's plastic so it won't stick, and even if you get little bits of it that are left over, it peels off really easy. Or if it's totally embedded, you can just sand it off. It sands off like nothing. It's like it was part of the epoxy. I have a couple specific grits that I use for epoxy. There's actually this 150 grit. It's silicon carbide. This stuff is perfect for epoxy. You might think it's rough and they might need to go finer, but epoxy, especially the Magic Resin, if you apply it properly, it'll make your scratches vanish. As long as you clean them with the right solvents and it's dry, you will make your scratches vanish. As you can see, a lot of the scratches here vanished, but as far as a power based, this is a 220. I'm going to be using that in a sander that collects the dust. If you don't have a power sander that collects the dust, I find this type of dust is a little bit stickier than regular resins, and I don't mean that it's going to clump, but what I mean is it's not gonna slide off your surfaces. So you do either need to wipe it off, or you need to blow it off with something. So as you can see, Movie Magic has allowed me to jump forward and show you that I've done a quick pass with one disc of the power sander. Now, what I like to do is level everything and then focus on spots. And with that said, without any extra effort, I've already taken off my my epoxy gutters that were here. I'll zoom out a little bit. You can see what they would have looked like. You can kind of see, but it comes off. It takes a little bit of time, but you don't push hard because it'll wear out your sanders and they'll clump up with dust. But as far as labor-wise, it's very easy to sand this stuff. It's a little time consuming, otherwise you'll do less of a good job. But as far as labor-wise, it's two-finger sanding. All you gotta do is move the sander around.
All right, now, I'm wearing my mask still, but this is why we wear a mask, is because at this grit, the dust is very fine. You don't want to breathe that in at all. Even though it's non-toxic, that is not good to breathe in. So always wear breathing protection.
Okay, so I took down all the high spots. Everything's pretty much level or lower. Some of the spots that are missing epoxy from before need to be topped up. No problem. This epoxy levels really well. I'm actually going to clean it up now that I've sanded it with a little bit of rubbing alcohol on here. And as you can see, it starts to really reveal any spots you need to do. So you can tell where you need to keep going, and then this also dries nice and clean. As you can see, it's already evaporating clean off, and it's showing me any more of my scratches I still need to work on. We've pretty much got this taped off. One of the things that's important is that anything shiny gets at least a bit of a rub with sandpaper. That way you get a better bond. And one of the things that I've made here, this is actually 3 pieces of tape, sticky side up. I've made little tabs on the end so that I can hold each piece. And what I will do is once I fill this area with epoxy, I'm actually going to take this and very quickly put it over and smooth it over so that I can actually get that epoxy to pre-form where I want it. I'll have less sanding and I won't have to do as much shaping. So that's a little secret that I'll be doing. I actually have 2 of those tape panels made because I have another spot up there I'd like to use it. So now that we're all mixed up in the pill container again, and the reason I usually use the pill containers, like I said, is they have a flat bottom. But my mother has a lung disability, so she has lots of these lying around. And one of the reasons I use the Magic Resin is because it's non-toxic, there's no smell, and it doesn't bother or flare up her lung disability. So what we're going to actually be doing is we're going to take some and literally pour it in some of the spots we need it. Then we're going to take a razor blade, and I reuse my razor blades. and that's one spot done right there. So I'm just going to keep doing that over and over and over and over, and it'll turn out great. But Movie Magic will speed that up. Just watch. All right, so thanks to Movie Magic, we've got a cured hood. The tape that I used to hold all this epoxy in place has allowed me to basically shape it. There's high spots and some stuff I got to sand, but it's essentially filled in. Even though the hood is obviously curved, it's got several different contours, in fact. I've used that tape to keep the epoxy where I want it and have it build up just in the spots where I want it. So we have some nice big epoxy ridges, but that'll sand off real nice. We'll take off some of our tape. We'll fix up our bolt holes. Most of our cracks are actually gone completely. I do have obviously some more sanding and stuff to do, but essentially this hood is fixed. All I got to do now is the cosmetic bits. We have ourselves a good, solid, strong hood.
All right, so I've got the mask back on. Movie Magic has gotten me quite a few steps ahead here. The reason I like to harden up all my little bits and pieces before I do major sanding is because I actually use a wire wheel. I find the wire wheel does a great job of exposing fibers so that you can get a real good bond. So you'll see even the spots I've already glued. I've gone back over with the wire wheel. I've also brought down my epoxy ridges a little bit. Like I still have lots to go. But the reason I like to start with something structurally sturdy is because I really like to get at it with the wire wheel. And if you have bits that are loose, this is going to throw them right off. So that's the reason I kind of start with an extra step of hardening the broken piece so that I can fix it later.
All right, Movie Magic stepped in again. We are scraped and taped. I've cleaned off all the dust. I've cleaned with solvent. And I'm basically ready with my pieces of cloth laid out where I'm going to be attaching them at the various places for reinforcement. Because it's not just enough to fix the spot, you also want to reinforce it so it doesn't happen again. Otherwise, you're going to be fixing it again. And there's only so many times you can break certain areas before they're just too brittle to fix. So I'm going to try and prevent that and make it stronger than it was before. We can rebuild it. We have the technology. Okay, so whenever we're actually reinforcing something and we're bonding layers together, I have a process. I don't know if this is the right process, but this is mine. What I actually do is go ahead and pre-coat the area generously with epoxy. And I mean really go to it with the epoxy. You can wipe it off. This is a fairly long work time epoxy. Some of them, some of them are faster, but it's not a 5-minute epoxy or anything. So this is our cloth piece that we're replacing that. And I'm actually gonna get right in there with my hands because this epoxy won't melt your gloves, so feel free. You want good coverage everywhere your cloth is going to stick. But then you don't just put dry cloth on that. I'm going to take the bonding side. I'm going to smear that all over the place. Make sure it gets right in there. Now, if you have to pull out any threads, Never pull them off to the side. You want to pull them out lengthways so that it doesn't disturb your weave and so that it doesn't move your cloth that you just placed. There, we just learned how to reinforce fiberglass with a piece of carbon fiber Kevlar. With Movie Magic on our side, now we're looking at a dried, reinforced piece. And as you can see, that is just rock solid. I've reinforced with epoxy a lot of the stuff that was already repaired. It was previously repaired improperly, so what I did was expose the fibers as best I could. Some of the spots were just too inundated with previous epoxy. I had to kind of live with them the way they were. It all looks great on the other side, but you'll see I've basically reinforced every little break that there was, and you see the tape just pulls right off so that we're left with actually a real good solid piece, and it has a decent finish on it. I'll still sand it, do a couple things, but yeah, everything that used to be busted is now perfectly solid. Needs to be re-drilled, but I'm really happy. Jumping forward with Movie Magic once again. Here you see it's kind of scraped and taped. All these scratches here are from the wire brush. Don't worry, those are going to vanish. The beauty of the Magic Resin is that you can pour it on and it self-levels, and then if you scrape it, it actually fills in all those cracks real nicely. It's going to look great. Poof! Movie Magic again. We have some epoxy mixed up on our tray here, and we have the hood ready to go. And there's a couple tricks I like to use, and they're very low tech. If you just watch this technique here, okay, very precise, very precise. Oh, just rub it in, rub it in. Yeah, yeah, it likes that. The hood likes that. Who's a nice hood? Who's a nice hood? Oh, yeah.